I want to get back to our study in Revelation. I heard a little girl call it, the book of Revelation has been called by many different names. Everything from revolutions to this term, the latest one I heard was most appropriate. A little girl called it the book of re-evaluation. I thought that was appropriate, don't you? I think it actually fits. Re-evaluation. I want to study again in chapter 13. We're looking at the subject that is taboo for most groups and individuals for that matter, if they want to get along socially. We're looking at two of the most taboo subjects there is, and that is politics and religion. Our groups, when we gather together, we have kind of an unwritten statement that nobody gets political and nobody gets religious in the group, and that way everybody can get along. Because if you start talking about politics and religion, sooner or later there's going to be a fight that erupts. Well, John evidently didn't get the memo, because in chapter 13, that's all he talks about is politics and religion. He tells us about it through a vision that he saw. Another one of his visions. And again, let me just give you a little tidbit on the study of Revelation that's been extremely helpful for me. And I think it might be useful for you as well as you read these verses and chapters in this book. We can't put the book of Revelation in chronological order. You can't say, well, it starts here, at this such time, and it goes all the way. Some people have done that. I've seen people try to decide when the Antichrist was going to appear on the scene. And they also get into all kinds of discussions about when Jesus is coming back, when Jesus himself was very clear on this to his disciples. He says, it's not given to you to know the times or the seasons, but the Father knows. So you don't know when he's coming back. But I've seen people, make these little timelines and say, well, Jesus should come back here at this time. And then beginning there, you have the rapture of the church, if they're pre-trib rapture. And you got 7 years of Jacob's trouble, and then you got the second coming, and after that you've got the millennial reign of Christ for 1,000 years on this earth, etc., etc. That's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with speculating along that line, but I want you to understand that's all it is speculation. Because if you've read the book of re-evaluation, you might want to re-evaluate your timeline. Because John doesn't write it in a timeline. If you want a timeline, all you can see is John's first vision, his second vision, his third vision, his fourth vision, his fifth vision. That's the timeline here that's presented for us in this book. It's a series of visions that John has. Now, within those visions, there are pictures of various things, symbols of various things, the concepts, and it's written in a kind of a strange language. We know it in the literary style of apocalyptic language, which means it's primarily symbols, pictures and symbols. Not that the text is not there. You've got text that we're reading, but the fact is that you're reading words that aren't making sense. For instance, in the last chapter, we studied this vision that John had. The very first thing he saw was a pregnant woman standing on the moon with a crown of stars. Now, what does that mean? See, if you just look at the text itself, it's not understandable. But if you view it as a symbol, then you can put meaning to it. Now, the reason, and I asked this question frequently when I was studying Revelation myself, I asked this question of God. I said, why do you do it that way? Why don't you just say what you mean and describe it in words that I'm understanding and words that I know what they mean, etc., instead of all these visions here? Well, he gave me two reasons. First of all, the first and probably the most important reason is when you see a vision, when you actually get a picture in your mind, it's worth 1,000 words. It would take 1,000 words to describe what that picture in your mind reveals to you. And secondly, he told me, like everything else, it requires faith in the personal leadership of the Spirit to teach you what I want you to learn out of this. So, It's not an academic study we're doing. We're not just doing this like you would a school project or a report on a book that you read, a book report. We're doing an intensive personal study of visions that John related to us, that were given to John by Jesus so that he could give it to us and we could learn what it is we need to know about Jesus. Keep in mind, it's a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, when we get into this point in chapters 12 and 13 and 14, 15, on down the ways, we're going to be preoccupied with certain cataclysmic events on this earth that are coming in the future, and we'll have a tendency to turn away from our view of Jesus. We'll have a tendency just to be concerned, like we are in chapter 13, for instance. We're just concerned with two puppets that Satan uses to deceive the world. And our attention goes away from Jesus to these two puppets, the Antichrist and the false prophet. Well, we've got to be careful with that, because pretty soon we can lose sight of Jesus when this book is all about the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is not the revelation of the Antichrist. This is not the revelation of Satan. It's not the revelation of the false prophet. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. So we've always got to remind ourselves and come back to the main purpose of this book. With that in mind, I want to ask this question. I want you to ponder this in your mind. What does Jesus want us to know about the way Satan is working in this world today to establish what is being prophesied here in a one-world government with one world religion? What does Jesus want us to know about it? Why does he want us to know about that in the first place? And what does he want us to do about that? What does he want us to believe? What does he want us to understand? In order to get a grasp of that, I want to go back to what I shared with you here probably 2 or 3 months ago now. I forget. But I shared with the fact that you all, as believers in Jesus Christ, who are inseparably joined to Jesus, are involved in a spiritual war that began before the foundation of the world with Satan's rebellion, continues yet today, and will continue on into the future as the Revelation describes. Now, who is this war against? Who's involved in this war? It's none other than Jesus and all evil, personified in the evil one, Satan, the devil. That ancient serpent he's called here. So there's an ongoing raging war, a spiritual war, that we as believers in Jesus Christ are immediately enlisted. We are immediately drafted, if you will, into the army of Christ. That's why the Bible uses some military terms and figures of speech to illustrate this, because they know it's a war. Paul admonished the Ephesians in his letter. He said, you're not wrestling with flesh and blood. Your problem's not people. You're fighting with principalities and powers, spiritual wickedness in high places. You're fighting with spirit beings that have been around since before the world was created. You're not fighting with people. Now, a failure to understand that, a failure to understand that we are involved in what Jesus is doing to conquer evil in this world, will miss the whole purpose of the Revelation. You see, the good thing about the Revelation, the reason it's the last book of the Bible, is because Jesus wins. That's it, hands down. No matter whatever else is going on, no matter what else you can say about it, you've got to arrive at the conclusion that Jesus wins. He's the final victory. Until that time, we're in a struggle, and that struggle will go on according to his plan, because even though the god of this world, Satan, at the present time has free reign over the world, and as we learned in our last study, in our last chapter, in chapter 12, God has given him permission to be the ruler over this world. He is the prince and the power of the air. He's the ruler of the darkness of this world. God has given him permission. That means it's given him the leeway to in essence, blind the world. Now you say, why does God do that? Well, we got to go back to this whole subject again of why God gave you a freedom of choice. Why did God give you a freedom of choice? You all know you have freedom of choice. You can choose against God or for God. You have that freedom of choice. And God was bound to give you that freedom of choice for one reason and one reason only, so that you could freely choose to love Him, to trust Him, to worship Him. See, if you didn't have a freedom of choice, if you were nothing but a robot, then your worship of God, your faith in God, your love for God would mean nothing. It would be like us making a mud pie somewhere and assuming that that mud pie loves us. It would mean nothing to God. Only if you have the choice not to worship Him does your worship mean anything to God. Only when you have the freedom to rebel against God does your trust in Him mean anything. So He's giving you this freedom of choice. He gave it to His angelic beings. Satan, who was Lucifer, the highest angel, the highest archangel, the most glorious creature God had ever made, freely chose to rebel against God, and apparently he took about a third of the angelic beings with him, who also freely chose to rebel against God. And since that time, there's been this continuous, ongoing spiritual warfare. Now you say, well, God sure is taking a long time to figure this thing out or make this thing happen, or Jesus is taking a long time to win this. Well, from our perspective in time, that's true. But remember what Peter tells us. With God, one day is like 1,000 years. And 1,000 years is like one day. Now, you can't even conceive of 1,000 years. We can barely even conceive of 100 years. What he's saying is time doesn't mean anything with God because He's not bound in time. He's in eternity. So using Peter's math on that, God's been working on this thing for about, roughly 6 days. And on the 7th, He's going to defeat evil. You see, He's taken His time in our perception of time because it hasn't happened yet. But the point is, and I know you struggle like I do with this fact, that it seems to me like God is always late. Did you ever have that problem? It seems like He should have done something by now. And when it comes to the evil of this world, it seems like God should have overcome this already. And that He's late in doing it. And He should get on with the program. But God is doing exactly what He knows is best. Perfectly. So the Revelation, we cannot study it as a sequence of events that are coming, even in future events. That's about as good as we can do, as we can say these things have happened, Revelation 2 and 3, and are happening right now in the present world, in the church age that we live in. And these things will happen in the future. But you see, what happens in the future has roots in the present right now. And it's developing. So with that reminder, let's come back to chapter 13. We're told that in chapter 12 that Satan has no more access to heaven. God won't let him in there anymore. He's been cast down. He's got no more access to heaven. And so he's enraged. He is mad. You see, all up to this point, he had tried to kill the woman before she had the child that we learned about, which is Christ. And when the child was born, he tried to kill him before he ascended into heaven as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Satan blew it. He missed. He didn't get the job done. Jesus won the victory. He has ascended into the heavens far above all principality and power, and has sat down at the right hand of the Father. And Satan is cast out. He's mad. Not being able to get to the child, he turns his full attention on the woman in chapter 12. Now, I'll remind you again, the woman is a symbol for God's people. In the New Testament, sometimes it's referred to, God's people are referred to as the bride of Christ, the woman. In the Old Testament, it was the bride of God, Israel. They're God's people. That's you. That's who he's after. He seeks to persecute them. But he doesn't do it directly. He doesn't come at us directly. He's sneakier than that. If he would just openly manifest himself and show up where we could see him, we could listen to him and hear him with these ears, we might be frightened for a while, but we know what we're dealing with. We wouldn't be deceived. He would be openly manifest to it, but he doesn't do that. As Jesus reminds us, he's the father of lies, the master of deception. And so he comes after us through two puppets that are described for us here. Puppets in the sense that they do his bidding according to his power and authority that has been granted to him on this earth. The first puppet we read about in chapter 13 is that beast that came up out of the sea beast, if you will, that grotesque monster from God's viewpoint. The political system that seeks to rule over mankind apart from God or anything to do with God is a monster, a political monster. That political monster has come throughout the ages in a succession of world empires, going all the way back to the Chaldean Empire where Daniel first prophesied this. The Medes and Persians after them, the Greeks after them, the Romans after them. And this next world empire that's coming on the scene right now will be a puppet of Satan. It's meant to deceive and blaspheme the gospel. The political system, in a nutshell, says that first of all, why would God want us to know about that? Why would Jesus want you to know about that? So you don't fall for the political rhetoric of the government saving you. They can't, and they never will. Especially a government that has removed God. That's why he wants you to know about this. He wants you, as his servant, to know that the puppet that Satan is using, is a political force that's meant to control and dominate you. Unfortunately, this country has fallen prey to that. I don't fault our current generation as much as I do the ones in the past, but we have a responsibility in it as well. I'll just give you one example because I don't intend to be political here. Back in the 30s, the nation decided that we really ought to honor our father and mothers. We really should do one of those 10 commandments. And so the best way we can do that is to legislate that and enforce that on everybody in what's called a social security system. We're going to honor our father and mother. We're going to take care of them in their old age. We don't need God moving in the hearts and providing for His people to take care of their old folks. The government will do it. Back in the 60s, we had the war on poverty. We're going to eliminate poverty. We're going to fight poverty. Never mind, Jesus said the poor will always be with you. We're going to eliminate poverty because Jesus didn't know what He's talking about. That was 2,000 years ago. We're smarter now. We know how to take care of poor people. And the government started numerous systems. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a political system out from under the rule of God that's no longer using God as their sole strength of wisdom. This nation was founded on a faith in a personal God. That's why we have the liberties we have, the rights we have, because God gave them to us. It wasn't the Democrats that gave them to us. It wasn't the Republicans that are trying to take it from us. It was God that gave it to us. See, God supersedes any kind of government. Any kind of government. And His provisions do not require government subsidies. But the political system that's being set up right now, that will emerge into what John describes here as a seven-headed monster, will continue to blaspheme God by saying, we know how to take care of you folks better than God does. And we'll promise you this program, and we'll promise you that program, and we'll take care of you. We will meet your needs. Now, when somebody starts meeting your needs, that's who you worship. So it is any wonder that John describes for us in chapter 13, when the beast finally comes on the scene, and he actually achieves notoriety worldwide, that people worship him and the power behind him, the devil. Why? Because he's meeting their needs. You see, he only will appear as a grotesque-looking monster to the people who have the vision God has. To everybody else, he'll look good. But John also tells us about another puppet here in chapter 13, another puppet of Satan, whereby he seeks to persecute the church. And this is the one that I want to spend the most time on today. It's the false prophet, who's named the false prophet later. He calls him the beast that came up out of the earth. Now, this grotesque beast isn't quite as monstrous as the first one that came up out of the sea, inasmuch as he kind of looks like a lamb. He's got horns like a lamb, but he speaks with a mouth like the dragon. He doesn't have 7 heads here. This beast, the second beast that comes on, represents, as we've already studied, the religious systems of the world being amalgamated into one religious system. And it'll be done according to the plan of the puppeteer, the one who's pulling the strings, Satan himself. Now, when that plan unfolds, what's going to happen in this world is that people are not going to be secular anymore. Did you know that? Secular humanism will run its race and will have completed its purpose to draw you away from God. They will become extraordinarily religious. You can already begin to see the seeds of that in our culture today. And there's some good to it. inasmuch as people are looking for that which is spiritual against that which is religious, there's a hunger for it. But that hunger can be satisfied by false promises as well. So I want to give you what I consider to be the key to unlocking the strategies of this second beast. I want to give you an understanding of what it's going to take to fight that second beast as well as the first. And that is with your weapons that God has already given you. Your spiritual sword, the Word of God. All of that spiritual armor God has given you as one of His children to use in this spiritual war we fight. Above all, above that sword, above the armor, we have the shield of faith. The shield of faith. That's why faith is so important in every aspect of your life as a believer. Because faith is what the goal is here. Who are you going to trust to meet your needs? You're going to trust the government to meet your needs? You're going to trust God to meet your needs? You're going to trust your own ability to meet your needs? You're going to trust God to meet your needs? Who are you trusting to meet your needs? It's a matter of faith. And what I want to warn you about is the methodology that the false prophet uses that's already in effect. As John tells us in his first general letter, the spirit of Antichrist is already here. So the spirit of the false prophet is already among us. And how is that being manifested today? I want you to know the difference between the authentic faith, which is the shield of faith, and the toxic faith that Satan offers as a counterfeit. Now keep in mind, everything in chapter 13 is about this unholy trinity as a counterfeit to what God has done and is doing. Everything. The devil is a counterfeit of God the Father. The first sea beast, the Antichrist, is a counterfeit of God the Son, Jesus. The second earth beast, the false prophet, is a counterfeit of the Holy Spirit. And they all three are mimicking and counterfeiting the work of God on behalf of humanity. So when we come to the false prophet, here's his greatest counterfeit. He slips in under the guise of truth what I call a toxic faith. And so when people exercising that toxic faith, when you challenge them on faith, they say, oh, no, I believe. The question is, what are you believing in? And there's a fundamental difference between toxic faith and authentic faith. Satan, with his puppets, will instill in you, seeks to instill in you a toxic faith because he knows the end result. You see, the toxic faith, and I'm going to describe for you, leads to a religious lifestyle. So you become religious, not spiritual. Don't confuse what I'm saying. Not spiritual, but you become religious. And that religiosity in time leads to spiritual abuse of yourself and other people. That's the system that's coming. And the seeds for that system is already planted. So how do we recognize it? Well, let me give you this little contrast to help you understand the difference of toxic faith. And by the way, I know it's easier to see this in other people than it is in yourself. And we can use examples of other people instead of us. But that's not the importance of our study here today. Our study is for us. So what I want you to do is try to examine yourself for your own toxic faith, according to the contrast that I want to give you. First and foremost, difference between toxic faith and authentic faith is that toxic faith is imposed on the individual externally from without the individual through threat and coercion. In other words, you're made to believe something is true. You're forced to. In contrast with that, authentic faith arises from within the individual as a healthy response to the offer of love and forgiveness. Authentic faith comes from within you. It's what you believe. Toxic faith is what other people tell you to believe. Outside sources tell you to believe. Now, here's one of the problems. This is why I'm praying for those kids every week. Your children have no choice but to grow up in a toxic faith, because they didn't make up their mind for themselves. They weren't old enough. You did. You told them what to believe. Most people in a religious system are born into that system. And that toxic faith starts immediately when it's forced on children. That's why I always encourage, and I'm always glad to see teenage rebellion. Did you know that? Because every teenager has to rebel. Otherwise, they'll never discover authentic faith. They'll only accept what other people have told them and not believe because they believe it. Toxic faith is the kind of faith that's been propagated throughout world history. That's the war behind all wars. It's the kind of faith that Constantine and his armies tried to impose on the Holy Land when his armies marched through Palestine and insisted that people convert to Christianity or he would kill them. They were forced to believe in something they didn't believe. What good is that? See, if you're forced against your will to believe something, that's not genuine faith, that's toxic faith. I know it gets a little confusing, so let's go to the next one to help clarify you. The next contrast between toxic faith and authentic faith is the focus of your faith. In other words, what's the object of your faith? What are you believing in? Authentic faith, true faith, is focused only on God and what He does for you that you can't do for yourself. It's focused in on what God provides for you. Toxic faith, on the other hand, is always focused on you and what you've got to do to get ahead, what you've got to do to satisfy your needs, what you've got to do to be okay, what you've got to do to manipulate the deity to bless you. It's always, always, always focused on your own behavior and your own performance rather than on God and what He's provided. When you see people who are worried about what they're going to do and who are all wrapped up with, is it right or is it wrong? You see people who are believing naturally with a toxic faith that if they just know what's right, they can do it. And if they just know what's wrong, they can quit doing it. You see people who are trusting in themselves with a toxic faith, not an authentic faith, even if it has a religious veneer over it. Probably the greatest distinction between the two, though, is this last distinction in terms of the expression of that faith. The way toxic faith is expressed is radically different than the way authentic faith is expressed. Toxic faith always expresses itself in the desire to manipulate, to control, and to run things.